Okay, ready? Okay, tell me, what was it like during the Depression?
Well, during the Depression, it was a very difficult time because there was so much unemployment, so much poverty, and they didn't have all the relief things they have now. And of course, I was caught right at the time because I was trying to go to school, and I'd have to quit school and work a while. And I remember an old friend of mine with a big bag of beans that was all he could get for relief. He'd go out on the street and try to get a job. You know, they had corners where they could get all lined up and wait for somebody to come by and give them a day's work. And I remember he used to go down there and try to get a day's work. And he showed me a bag of beans one time. That was his relief.
Yeah. Was there any kind of safety net for people in those years?
Well, there weren't any safety nets in those days. I don't think anybody ever heard of them.
Okay. Can you tell me, why do you think that Upton Sinclair was popular at that time?
Well, because he said he was going to, Upton Sinclair was popular then because he said he was going to end poverty in California. And that sounded pretty good to most people, particularly those who were impoverished. But, of course, he admitted he was a socialist, but he didn't run as a socialist, he ran as a Democrat. And he really took over the Democratic Party and caused a lot of confusion.
You were a Democrat at that time. What did you think about it? Were you upset with him? Did you think,
Well,
I don't know, what did you think?
Well, at that time, I didn't know what to think because I'd always been a Democrat, particularly a Woodrow Wilson Democrat. And Upton Sinclair didn't stack up with that kind of people. So I didn't know what to do. I couldn't get out and support him, even though he was a Democrat.
Okay. You went to some epic meetings. What were they like?
Well, epic meetings were big mass meetings in those days. I think they used to charge 10 cents to get in. And he took in quite a bit of money at 10 cents each because people didn't have any money, and 10 cents was 10 cents then. So that people were out on the street trying to get in. It was amazing the crowds that he drew.
And wasn't it kind of unusual at that time to charge admission to a political rally?
Well, in those days, I don't think they'd ever charge admission to get to political rallies. They were glad to get people there. But they were glad to come. For Sinclair, his followers were glad to come and pay to get in and see him.
Why did they pay? Did they pay because they felt they were part, that he had no big money coming in from anyplace else, and this was the reason, that they needed everybody to contribute? Was there that kind of feeling?
Well, I think Upton Sinclair told them that he didn't have any big contributors, and the other side had a lot of them, and that he depended on the people for his money. So people who had 10 cents contributed 10 cents, and they stormed the meetings.
Okay, great. Were you concerned at all about the future of the Democratic Party at that time? I guess there's two things going on. One is that I think that Upton Sinclair brought a lot more Democratic voters in and helped there were more Democrats at that time. But were you concerned at all about what the Democratic Party was going to be like later because of Sinclair? Did he revitalize it, or did you feel he made it too much to the left?
Well, we were all concerned about what he was doing to the Democratic Party because nobody knew exactly what was going to happen. The state had been primarily a Republican state, and so he did bring a lot of people out to vote for him, and I don't know how many of them remained Democratic, but in those days, he made a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sorry, can you tell me a little bit of that again by saying who he is? Because you're saying he, and so in reference to the...
Well, Upton Sinclair caused a lot of confusion in the Democratic Party because he admitted he was a socialist, and most of the Democrats were not socialists, and so they didn't know what he was going to do to the party or what was going to happen in the future, and they were afraid if he got elected, he might be the last Democrat to be elected.
Okay. What do you think about Miriam as a candidate?
Well, I knew Merriam because I served under him up in the legislature.
No, but talking about before you served. In 1934, when Miriam was running for governor, do you remember him at all as a candidate?
Well, I don't remember Merriam as a candidate very well, but he was a candidate of big interest. In those days, the Hearst papers and the Los Angeles Times and the Oakland Tribune could get together and decide who they wanted to win in California, and they all stuck together, and they could really control the state. So they were all for Merriam, and most of us were not.
Okay. Do you remember Sinclair at one time said if he was elected, half of the unemployed in the United States would flock to California? Do you remember that statement?
Well, I don't think Upton Sinclair ever made the statement that half the people in the United States would come to California, but that was propaganda put out against him, and it really carried over because I think it was really true. With end poverty in California, all the impoverished people would want to come here.
Okay. Did you vote for Sinclair?
Well, frankly, I don't remember whether I did or not. I don't remember whether I voted for him or not.
Okay. Do you think that were you aware at that time that that Sinclair had gone to Hyde Park to try to get Roosevelt's support, and that Roosevelt didn't really give him the support? Were you aware of that happening at the time?
Well, I wasn't aware that Sinclair ever went to Roosevelt and tried to get his support, but of course Roosevelt would not support Sinclair because Roosevelt was really a Democrat, and he wouldn't support a socialist.
If Roosevelt had come out for Sinclair, do you think you would have voted for him? Would that have affected your decision?
I think if Roosevelt had campaigned for Sinclair,
I'm sorry, just a moment.
it would have
I'm
affected.
sorry, wait a minute. We have to change. Okay, let's go. We finished off before. I was asking you that if Roosevelt or kind of any of the Democratic establishment had really come out for Sinclair, would that have affected the way you would have thought of him as a candidate?
Well, I think if Franklin Roosevelt had really campaigned for Sinclair, he could have been elected because Roosevelt was so popular, and to be on a ticket with Roosevelt or have his backing was a main ingredient in being elected.
Personally, do you think it would have affected your vote?
Well, it might have because I was a great admirer of Franklin Roosevelt after he got up and said, "We have nothing but fear itself." I remember I was on my way to my job as a motion picture projectionist, which was one of the things I learned to do during the Depression. And I remember how that inspired me, and I'm sure it inspired a lot of people.
Okay, and so just to finish off the answer, this is something we had talked about a little bit in the pre-interview. If Roosevelt had said, vote for, had come out in favor of the EPIC plan, do you think you would have voted for, would have that made you want to vote for Sinclair?
Well, if Roosevelt had come out for Sinclair, it would have made a lot of us want to vote for him. Whether we would have or not, I don't remember now. But it certainly would have been influential.
Okay, great. Yes. Okay. You told me before that the platform was called Uppy and Downy, and that was kind of amusing to you?
Well, the platform was not Uppy and Downy. That's what we called them, because Sheridan Downey had been an assistant district attorney in Denver before he moved out here, and he ran for lieutenant governor with Sinclair, and it became known as Uppy and Downy. And of course, Downey was later elected United States Senator.
Okay. What did it mean to be a Democrat in 1934? What was the what did the party represent to you?
Well, the party represented the sort of underdog, the people who were striving to get ahead. And labor was a big part of the Democratic Party, still is. And labor was much weaker in those days than it later became. So to be a Democrat was just to be on the side of the people.
Okay, great. Tell me a little bit about the Townsend movement. What was it about? Why did you get attracted to it?
Well, Dr. Townsend was a medical doctor in Long Beach, California, and he saw that technology was improving our production facilities so much that we were really overproducing and causing prices to go down, and that we needed consumption. So he said, let the old people retire from the working force and become consumers, and give them, I think, $200 a month, at the age of 60 or 65, I've forgotten which it was now, but he said they'll consume and that the young people produce. And it made a lot of sense, and it just took the country by storm. The whole United States was up practically on his side, and it was so strong that Roosevelt had to do something about it. And I think that's how Roosevelt got the idea of Social Security, was to give people something to look forward to in old age.
Okay, great. Why do you think Townsend pushed, you said that you think Townsend pushed Roosevelt. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, he was so powerful politically.
Who was he?
Well, I'm talking about Dr. Townsend.
Okay.
Dr. Townsend was so popular politically that what he stood for made so much sense to people that I think Roosevelt wanted to be reelected, of course, as he always did, that had to do something about that problem of the old people, and Dr. Townsend had a good answer.
Okay, yeah.
Just to be on the safe side, could you just do that one again?
Okay. We need to do the
Just
answer?
yeah.
Okay, we just had a camera problem, so can we do this again? About Roosevelt, why Townsend pushed Roosevelt to enact Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
One more time, sorry. Okay, we're ready.
Well, Franklin Roosevelt was very popular in those days, 1933 and 34, and Dr. Townsend was very popular too, and became politically very powerful because so many people believed in what he was doing and what he was saying. So I think Roosevelt realized that he had to do something for the old people who had no safety net, right? No Social Security of any kind. So I think he developed Social Security as a compromise to prevent the Townsend plan from just taking over.
Okay. You were a young person then. Why did the Townsend plan matter to you? Or why did Social Security matter to you? You wouldn't be affected by it. It was something that was affecting older people.
Well, I wasn't thinking personally. Of course, I was having a hard time like everybody else was. But I think during the Depression, we knew that something needed to be done to get people out of the Depression, out of those bad circumstances. And anything that held out hope was useful, but particularly to get the old people to consuming and not have them producing. That was a good idea.
Some people said Townsend plan would never work. Did you feel it could work?
Well, I think it has worked in the sense that old people are not now just dependent on working or losing their job when they need security. And the Social Security is not as great as the Townsend plan would have been, but it's been a very good plan.
Okay, did you ever, do you remember the atmosphere at any Townsend meetings that you went to? What it was like?
Well, I went to a lot of his meetings, and I went to his conventions after he wasn't so popular. And he had a big following, and he was a very honest man and spoke very forcefully and not a great orator, but with a great willpower. And he influenced a lot of people, and they were all for him.
Okay. Do you feel like, so he feel like that Townsend kind of challenged, was one of the challengers to Roosevelt?
Well,
challenging him to do more, I guess.
Well, I think Dr. Townsend certainly challenged Roosevelt to do more for the poor old people. And he did more, and I think he did partly because he had to do something, because Townsend had made people aware of the fact that they could be consumers without being producers.
Okay, great. Please stop for a moment. What were movies like in those days?
Well, there were good movies and bad movies.
Mm-hmm.
But MGM was a big producer then. If the theaters couldn't make a contract to run MGM movies, they couldn't run really good movies because they're mostly MGM.
Were movies real popular? Did people go to the movies to kind of escape? Did they go to be entertained?
Well, they went to movies for the same reason they do now, to be entertained and to escape for a little while. And of course, in those days, they didn't have any sound, you know. They had to flash on the screen what they were saying. And some of the great actors in the silent film couldn't make it in the talk films.
Okay, let's just stop for a second again. Yeah, that was a little bit earlier. By that time, there was sound. Okay.
Well, no, I ran this first.
You probably, when you were working as a projector, any sound, right?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
But it was on a record.
Yorty,
Oh,
take
I
5
see.
up.
And you had to set the record and set the film.
That last bit, sound cut before
Do you remember a specific
camera continued into the discussion
Simple.
about
dinner at 8?
what is it? Sound projection or something
You had
like
it
that.
wrong.
So don't worry about syncing it.
Why were you interested in politics? What did that mean to you?
Well, because I was interested in politics, because I'd always been interested in politics. I remember when I was a little kid, we lived next door to a lawyer, and I wanted an ice cream cone one time. I told Mother she'd give me a nickel for an ice cream cone. When I grew up, I'd be a lawyer and get her one. But when I was in the junior high, it was 1 year, experimental in Lincoln, Nebraska. The teacher asked us to write an essay, what we'd like to be, and I wrote about wanting to be a politician. And I remember my teacher, Mrs. Grubb, struck that out and put statesman in there.
Okay, great. I think we're done. Anything else you'd want to say on the subjects we've been talking about?
No, not on the subject.
Okay, great. Scott?